Hey everybody. So today we're going to start neural networks. And artificial neural networks are, of course, the biggest current version of AI, things that everybody is trying to do. But it's interesting to learn and think about how these neural networks, these machines, ended up being the way they are. In fact, as you might guess, pretty much these machines that we are looking at, they are based on our idea of biology. To be brutally honest, what they are is they're based on a 1940s idea of neurobiology. And then that branch of looking at neurobiology in a particular kind of way became its own set of mathematics, its own engineering endeavor over the decades that followed. So while our understanding and conceptualization of the brain has evolved quite a bit, there's some pretty big gaps between how artificial neural networks work and real neural networks. So the point of what I'm going to do today in this pre-lecture is I'm going to talk a little bit about the real neuroscience, about the brain, and what we know and how we know it, and the history of essentially artificial neural networks. Okay, let's dig in. So all of this is essentially what you might get if you took COGS 107, but in less than 10 minutes, right? That's what I'm trying for. So let's start. What is the mind is a question that philosophers and everyday people have been asking for literally millennia. Any kind of early Greek philosopher or Eastern philosophy from 2,500 years ago, they're all fundamentally grappling with what a mind is and how we are who we are. Okay. While some of those developments, even thousands of years ago, especially in China, while they may have been fundamentally on the side of, hey, the mind is just a physical process, it is a material process, that thread of thinking definitely got lost in the West. And in the medieval period, where the society is highly religious and, what the Pope says goes, well, there was a strong tradition in European philosophy that the mind was, in fact, the soul. Like there was this difference between what is the body and what is the brain, or what is the mind, I should say. And so this dualism, this idea that there are two things that are you, physical stuff and mental stuff, where mental stuff, largely speaking, is just your soul. And somehow your soul is puppeteering your body. So this fine-looking gentleman here, René Descartes, was a very, very famous philosopher in the late medieval period, early Renaissance. And he was one of the pioneers of establishing, in a very formal way, this idea of dualism, of body stuff, things in the body. This is one of his diagrams, right? And stuff in the body does body stuff, like we get to see the arrow in our eyes, and we know there's some sort of, when they would take apart bodies, they would see these nerve tracks. But then these nerve tracks end in some mysterious organ. And in this mysterious organ, that's where the soul gets a hold of your mental stuff, somehow gets a hold of everything that your body is doing. And then your mental stuff, your soul, sends puppeteering commands to your nerves to make your arm do things. This dualism is not the way we understand things today, right? The idea is that the mind is matter. This viewpoint here, right? If you just posit something that is the mind, which is mysterious, it's like having a little tiny person inside you. And how does that person think, right? How does that person have memory? Well, I guess inside that little tiny person's head, somewhere inside it is another little tiny person. And it must be little tiny people all the way down, right? So if you postulate that there is no mysterious soul stuff, that everything is somehow physical, then you have to explain in the interactions of physical things how mind happens. And that's tough. That problem has occupied philosophers for hundreds of years. So broadly speaking, the modern viewpoint, certainly in neuroscience, is that the mind is only the actions and states of matter. The nervous system, and I would add to that, not just the nervous system, but the interaction of the nervous system and the rest of the body, and the interaction of the body and its nervous system with the environment. That is the mind. The mind is not just the things inside your nervous system, it's also how your nervous system interacts with your body and how you have had an interaction history with the world that leads to your mind. Okay, so basically René Descartes was wrong. He put Descartes before the horse. And now we think that what we have to do to understand the mind is to understand how the brain works. Okay. So a big step forward, because, way back when, in the time of Descartes, it was actually kind of revolutionary to place the seat of the soul in the brain. Earlier people thought it was the heart, right? And they thought that the brain was just this kind of device to cool the blood. So before essentially last century, right? It was really in the very late 19th, early 20th century that people kind of understood a little bit about the nervous system and how it worked. But before then, they couldn't even understand what was going on in the nervous system. You would dissect a body and you would see these things that you could not really understand as separate units, as cells that we now call neurons. Because when you look at something even under a microscope, it's very hard to see the limits of a cell. As far as they were concerned, the nerves were just like a continuous set of tubes that were all completely interconnected with each other. There was no sense that the nervous system was composed of a lot of discrete neurons. They just didn't know. So the famous neuroscientist Ramon y Cajal, he was a pioneer of microscopy, and he learned to make these special kinds of stains that would, in kind of 1 out of 100 neurons, those stains would get sucked up and dye the neuron black. And then Ramon y Cajal would project his microscope onto a sheet of paper and then trace the resulting neuron. So he was the first person to really see the extent of what a neuron is and its shapes and how neurons might interrelate to each other. So that won him the Nobel Prize. And this leads to the idea of the Neuron Doctrine, the idea that the nervous system is not one set of continuous tubes, but it's a bunch of individual cells that signal to each other. And more than that, we know some things about how, that they're an electrochemical signal. All right, so this is our modern picture of how neurons work. So first off, it's important to say that neurons are not the only cell type in the nervous system. Inside your brain, there are all kinds of other cells that are not neurons, and those cells, which are called glia, they are support. They both provide a physical support to hold neurons in place, and they provide chemical and nutritional support. They're even involved in learning. But the thing is that only neurons have this electrical potential. And the electrical potential is how we think signals propagate around the brain. So each cell is some kind of electrochemical setup where there are chemical ions, chemicals that have positive or negative charge, that are inside the cell body and others that are outside the cell body. And when a neuron takes positively charged ions and throws them out of the body of the cell, then the neuron's voltage goes down, and vice versa, right? So what do we know about neurons now? We know that neurons get inputs from other neurons. So this neuron is sending an electrical impulse down its axon. Axons are the output of a neuron. The output of an electrical stimulus is flowing down this tube inside the cell. And when it gets to a synapse, where there's a gap where one cell ends and the next cell begins, that electrical signal causes these little bubbles that are called vesicles. These little bubbles contain molecules of a substance, and the electrical activity causes these vesicles to move into the cell membrane and bind with the membrane and send the chemical out into the synaptic cleft, into the gap between cells. Those chemicals end up getting attached to, like a lock into a key. They attach into a receptor on the cell membrane of the next cell on the chain. And when these chemicals bind into the receptor causes ions to move in and out of the postsynaptic cell. And then we get movement of ions, which creates an electrical potential, which then goes on just like we saw before. Now, neurons have inputs as well as outputs. The inputs, these branching structures, are called dendrites. These dendrites from a cell reach out and make contact with other cells' axons. And many cells are sending electrical stimuli through the cell. When it gets to the synapse, it lets out some sort of molecules. Those molecules bind onto the postsynaptic cell and cause an electrical change in that cell over and over and over again. Inputs come in on the dendrites. If those inputs are big enough, right? Like some electrical inputs will come in here and they'll just kind of fizzle out. Like there needs to be enough oomph for that signal to start to travel down the dendrite. And if there isn't enough signal for it to travel down the dendrite, the signal disappears. And even if it makes it down to the dendrite, once it hits the cell body, like think of this like there's like a big old pool of water. You can you can literally transform the math from water to electricity and back again, right? Voltage is like the potential of water. It's like if you have water in a water tower high up, and the potential energy of the drop going out of the water tower, that's the same thing as voltage. And if you don't have enough potential energy here, you're just not going to get anything happening once you get to this big old cell body where there's just a big old mass of inert chemicals that need to be pushed into firing. Okay? So there needs to be usually not just one synapse firing, but usually dozens or hundreds or maybe even thousands of synapses need to be active at the same time, roughly, for the potentials to change in the cell body enough for the cell body to send out an action potential down the axon. Okay? So fundamentally, you can look at neurons as integrators or summations, right? They sum up lots of synapses, maybe even as many as 10,000 or 100,000 synapses come into a given neuron. When the neuron gets enough activity coming from its synapses nearly simultaneously, it will fire off an action potential and send that out. So there's neurons all over your body, neurons in your skin and your eyes. They have receptors for things like, touch and light And neurons in your ear sense the vibrations of those bones behind your eardrum, right? And it begins a signal that goes into your brain. Well, actually it goes through your spinal column and then into your brain, except for the eyeballs. The eyeballs don't go through the spinal column. Okay, so neurons then, send signals in the brain, and eventually, after several different changes across different cell gaps, those same signals could start to come back and start to control muscles. All right, so we know a lot about how neurons work at the level of the sense organ or at the level of the muscle, but we don't know a lot about the stuff in the middle. There's a few brain regions that we've studied really well in a few animals. But the problem is that there is something like 100 billion neurons in the human brain. And there's something like 1,000 trillion, that is a quadrillion, connections between them. And, we see all kinds of things. Like I remember somebody I used to learn from was Jerry Edelman, and he would talk about how if you started counting synapses, one a second now, you wouldn't be done counting a single brain synapses before the end of the universe. Okay, so there's a lot of them. All right, we also know something about the brain, is that it's functionally segregated. So there are parts of your brain that specialize in vision. And even more than that, there's parts of your brain that specialize in processing information related to particular components of vision, like a particular part of your visual field, like neurons that specialize in just, the very left side of what you can see. There's also neurons that specialize in terms of, I respond only to vertical edges in the visual field, vertically oriented edges that are on the left side of what you can see. But the thing is that the function of seeing is not completely in one of these regions, right? Even though the brain is functionally segregated, that little tiny chunks of real estate specialize. In actuality, functions are spread across many regions. Even though there's one that specializes, there's always a backup that would take over if something got damaged in the primary area. And even when stuff isn't damaged, oftentimes other brain regions are involved in sensation, perception, cognition than the ones that are primarily associated with those things. So there's always more than one set of mechanisms that can support a function. Oftentimes those functions are operating simultaneously across lots of regions, but there's one region that takes quite a lot of the work. Now, this is in contrast to the idea that you may see in pop culture or 150 years ago when people would say, this is like the part of your brain that's responsible for how you really like food, right? Whatever. It's not that simple. It's not like this is where everything is. Okay. So the nervous system is composed of a lot of circuitry, a lot of this electrochemical circuitry. The circuitry is complicated. It goes around many different directions. Even when you see it makes sense. Here's a pathway that goes from the eyeball to a part of the thalamus that's responsible for visual signals, to the primary visual cortex, and then the pathway goes on to higher regions in the visual cortex where things are more abstractly represented. The thing that's not in that picture is that a lot of times these signals go backwards, and you'll have signals that go from higher levels of the visual cortex back down to primary visual cortex and go back down to visual thalamus and even modify things that are happening in the retina itself. Okay? Circuitry is dynamic. Synapses are getting stronger and weaker, more effective and less effective, appearing and disappearing all the time. Neurons also can get more and less excitable, where it takes fewer cells firing and giving input then it gets more excitable. That postsynaptic neuron can shoot an action potential out with fewer inputs than before. Okay? Even synapses themselves don't always act in deterministic ways. Sometimes they'll transmit a signal, sometimes the neurotransmitter just doesn't work. So circuitry in the brain is not necessarily just a straight path. Signals go forwards and backwards, so to speak, from lower levels to higher levels and back. All right, how does learning happen in the brain? Well, learning happens generically through changes in either a neuron, how the neuron responds, or in changes in the synapse between neurons. So neurons can become more or less excitable because each neuron wants to keep itself firing a very particular amount. If neurons don't fire enough, well, they're not useful, right? If neurons fire too much, they can actually poison themselves. Part of the chemical process produces a substance which is okay in small amounts, but in massive amounts of calcium hanging around, it will actually kill the neuron. Now I'm forgetting if it's calcium or potassium or sodium, actually. I can't remember. Whatever. Anyway, a neuron that's firing way too high a rate all the time will poison itself and kill itself off. So neurons just want to keep themselves firing a reasonable amount, and they have these mechanisms called homeostasis where they adjust their excitability so that they're always firing, on average, across chunks of time, roughly the same amount. Another thing that happens with neurons is that when they fire together, they wire together more strongly. This is an idea which is the basic understanding of how synapses work. When two, under normal conditions, right, if a neurotransmitter comes across and hits the postsynaptic dendrite here, it causes some chemical changes with sodium and potassium here, and maybe that electrical potential propagates, maybe it doesn't. But if this neuron fires and this neuron, the post, the green one, also fires, then the fact that this one caused this one to fire indicates that maybe we should change this synapse to represent whatever happened at this moment better, to make it more likely to occur in the future. And so that cell will potentiate the synapse. It will put more receptors or make other changes in the cell to make it easier for it to fire the next time the presynaptic cell sends some messages. So another thing that enhances learning is the idea of reward. If something is rewarding, if you get sugar or other inbuilt rewarding things like sex and feeling good in general ways, those things cause the release of chemicals, notably dopamine, but other chemicals in different ways. And those chemicals, the release of dopamine, they signal to neurons that, hey, whatever just happened gave me something I really, really liked. I want to make sure that whatever firing patterns there were just a moment ago, that they happen more frequently in the future. And more to the point, whatever happened a little bit before those patterns, that should also be made to happen more frequently because, 2 time slices ago, whatever happened led to 1 time slice ago, when whatever happened then led to me getting a rewarding event. Okay? So that kind of reward is fundamental to learning as well. And these synapses react to the release of dopamine and other chemicals, and they change in how they work in relationship to those reward chemicals. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is this metaphor of mind. So how do we understand the mind? Well, back in the Middle Ages, we understood it in terms of things that we understood in the Middle Ages, like soul. And as the Renaissance and Enlightenment came around, and there was even this incredibly mechanical culture, right? Clockwork and small kinds of machines came into being. We grabbed a hold of the tools that were around us then, and we started thinking of the brain as a clockwork. And once we had things like telephones and telegraphs, and then we suddenly started thinking of brains as electrical. Well, in the 1940s, computation became a real thing. And suddenly we grabbed a hold of this metaphor and started to understand the brain in terms of computation. So rather famously, Alan Turing asked, can machines think? And if they could think, how would we recognize that they are thinking? And thus was born the Turing test. Maybe you've heard of it. Turns out that we are living in an age where machines actually can pass the Turing test, which is, roughly speaking, can you tell the difference between talking with somebody through a keyboard who's a person and talking with a machine through a keyboard? If you can't tell the difference, then the machine, Alan Turing said, can, for all intents and purposes, think. We have issues with that, let's be honest. But that approach is a very famous one in artificial intelligence. So along the same lines, at the same time, besides Turing kicking this ideas out, we had other people asking questions like, how can we build electrical or mechanical devices that effectively think in their electrical and computing acts? This is Norbert Wiener, who's like the head of this movement called cybernetics, and that leads pretty directly to control systems. If anybody's had a control systems or signals theory class, right? Wiener is the beginning of that. Along the same time, we had this guy, Gray Walter, who built these little electrical robots. They were just not electronic, they're electrical. And he called them turtles. And he wired them up in ways that they looked like they were living. It looked like they were seeking out light and trying to move towards light, just the way a moth does. So by looking at these circuitry, Walter said, hey, here's some thinking machines. They think about very basic things. And then finally we get to these guys, Warren McCulloch, Walter Pitts, who propose a very simple mathematical model of how neurons might be sending signals around. And this McCulloch-Pitts neuron model is what we're going to talk about in class at the beginning. This finally leads us to our 1940s conception of a model of the brain that is going to become artificial neural networks. All right. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry, I just realized I went way too long on this, but hey, it's exciting. I love this stuff. Thanks so much. See you in class.